procurement is what most companies and governments do in Australia. So typically a company, 55% of its spend is on buying stuff, not labour, okay? That's most of what they do most of the time. And when we're talking about social procurement, we're actually talking about, sorry, I was using my computer. When we're talking about social procurement, we're talking about when buyers use their purchasing power to achieve social outcomes beyond the products and services that they are seeking to buy. That's social procurement. So just to give you an example, when we build a road, we are buying something. Government's buying a road, for example. That road has inherent social value. When you're doing social procurement, you're saying, what other value can we generate out of this road in its construction and maintenance above and beyond the inherent value that it has? i.e., can we create jobs for local people? Can we create employment for disadvantaged cohorts? Can we deliver environmental outcomes and so forth through that process? There are three fundamental drivers for social procurement. One is keeping money in local economies, and that's fundamentally about the leaky bucket model and keeping money in an economy to create greater wealth in that economy. That's usually done through local businesses or local content in a contract. So that's how we're finding buyers are actually achieving that outcome. And second motivation is employment for marginalised groups. So they want to address poverty, and they want to address poverty or inequality using procurement as a tool for achieving that outcome. And a third is economic empowerment, and that in Australia is usually in relation to Indigenous businesses. So preferencing Indigenous-owned businesses over mainstream businesses so that we can see greater wealth in the Indigenous community. We can see greater entrepreneurship and role models for young people who could aspire to become business leaders, as opposed to the traditional role models who are in sporting fields, medical and legal in that field. So it's really sort of saying we want a greater distribution of wealth, and we think by growing businesses that are owned by Indigenous people, that wealth distribution will occur. And so these are really fundamentally seen as ways of addressing or reducing disadvantage. And that's fundamentally what I'm going to be talking about. So really quickly, Anthony, I know you'll know this place quite well. This is the Atherton Gardens high-rise estate in Melbourne. It's the Fitzroy Public Housing Estate. If you've ever been to Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, you've probably seen this place. I worked in this public housing estate. So I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples, time permitting. This is the first one of social procurement. And what was really exciting about this is that this was one of the worst public housing estates in Victoria in around 2000. I won't go into all the indicators of disadvantage, but needless to say, they were quite high. One of them that stood out at the time was 95% joblessness, okay? We had 10 flats on every floor. We had 1 flat in every 20 on every 2 floors where someone worked, and that was their principal source of income. That's public housing in Australia, just to be really clear. We, to address some of the disadvantage in that community, we as a government organisation at the time, we were the Fitzroy Housing Office, and I was managing that office, made a decision that we wanted to change the way, we wanted to create employment for people. And we asked every business in the local area, from Woolworths to the St Vincent's Hospital, we tried to engage them in employing disadvantaged people in their businesses. And as soon as they saw the CVs of people who lived on this public housing estate, and generally you have to have gone through episodic behaviour of drug and alcohol, mental health issues or other factors to end up in public housing, they would never win work in a competitive process. And one day we had an aha moment, and that really was the moment where we said, we are the biggest spender in this community. We were spending $6 million across 2 public housing estates, Fitzroy and Collingwood. And every day that money walked off that estate, and every job that we created was an entry-level job. We had security, we had cleaning, and we had maintenance jobs. They were pretty entry-level jobs. And so we made a decision that we were going to change the way that we bought to create employment for public housing tenants. So we were using our procurement quite differently. The first thing we did was a $1 million cleaning contract, and we basically inserted a clause that 35% of the workforce had to be unemployed public housing tenants from Fitzroy and Collingwood high-rise estate. I won't simplify it too much, but what happened was 15 people got jobs, A year later, 14 of them still had jobs, and the company that actually won that tender in 2002 still has the tender today and still has 15 public housing tenants employed in their contract. It was pretty incredible. We said, what else can we do? So we did the same to the maintenance contract. We put a much lower figure. It was about 5% of the labour force had to be public housing tenants, usually young, and we were looking at apprenticeships. So eventually we ended up working with the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, which is a welfare organisation in Victoria, and we created, they said, we love what you're doing on this social procurement thing. We'd like to build a social enterprise that would employ disadvantaged people. And we agreed that security was the contract area. That was where we spent most of our money. They wanted to do it a little differently. They wanted to run a concierge service, basically. And so they started running this social enterprise. We came to an agreement. It was the same cost as the security company, so it was a fantastic outcome. 12 public housing tenants got jobs as a result of that. They did a certificate level qualification. They got 12 months work history, and then they pathwayed into the open labour market after that. And what was really interesting about this amazing use of our own money to drive more value was that in 2008, when I stopped finishing in that community, our joblessness rate had gone from 95% in 2000 to 81% in 2008. Only 30% of that community was deemed able to work, i.e. they were on New Start. So we had 2/3 of that 30% in jobs at that point, which was pretty profound and probably the lowest unemployment rate of any public housing estate in Australia. So that was really exciting at that time. And I just look at some of the anchors here, and I won't go into this too much, but Fitzroy Housing, having that lead organisation was really critical, having a really clear objective, having large aggregated spend, because we had $6 million to spend on one community. It could be super impactful. And we tapped into mainstream business and social enterprises in this process. I want to use another example now in Geelong. So this is not where I've worked, but it's an amazing tale. So Geelong is, I guess, you know, there's equivalents in New South Wales and Illawarra and in Wollongong and in Newcastle. Geelong is one of those, you know, towns about 90 k's away from a capital city, and it had a lot of manufacturing in that town that kept it buzzing. And in about 2012, two big companies said that they were going to leave Geelong. One was Ford and the other one was Alcoa. And they employed over 2,000 people in those companies, and it was going to have a big dent in that community. At the same time, there are two postcodes of disadvantage in the Geelong region. One's called Corio, the other one's called Norlane. They rank very badly on CEFA indexes. And what was really interesting is people had been trying to address disadvantage in Corio and Norlane for the previous 10 years. And everything had just gotten worse. So everything they'd done hadn't had the sort of impact that they were seeking. And what really happened that was kind of interesting is that one organisation, Give Where You Live, led a process in Geelong where they said, we think that if everything we've done hasn't really worked, we should try something significantly different. And there's a storm that's about to hit Geelong. How are we going to do things differently? And so they actually brought together business and government in that community and said, how can we collectively address this issue of the imminent decline of the Geelong region? And they came up with a project called Grow. And Grow had 5 tenets to it. The first was buying locally and socially. So any business or government that signed up to this made a commitment to buy from within the Geelong region, not everything, but to move their spend by, I think it was something between 5 and 10%. So we want 5 to 10% more of your spend in this local region. That was the significant ask. And they also wanted to buy from social enterprises. They were seeking, they wanted to invest in communities. So part of their strategy was to make capital available for small businesses to grow in the Geelong region. The other big lever in this was matching job seekers with employee needs. So they were actually working on the recruitment policies of all of those companies who had signed up to this compact. So they were looking from a spend commitment, and they were also looking at a recruitment commitment to change the face of the Geelong region. As well as that, they were looking at tracking and sharing progress, so a shared measurement platform and a collective impact model, which is what they were using in this project. And what they came up with over the last 4 years, so the project's been running this long, you can read it, is that they've spent the local, you can see on the left in the top and the bottom on the left, local spend has grown significantly. They had a dip in 1 year, and that could be one local business losing a significant contract, and that's why you can get a dip like that. But it's been a significant upward trend in terms of local spend in that community. And that translated to the job numbers that you can see on the right in blue and purple. So in the first year, they created 60 jobs. In the second year, they created 75. In the third, they created 112 local jobs. And in purple, it is jobs for people in that Corio-Norlane area. So who were the targeted people from the most disadvantaged communities? And they've created something like 40 jobs for the most disadvantaged people. And on top of that, in total, they've created something in the region of 250 jobs through changing the way they buy stuff. It's been super impactful. It's now being replicated in 4 other areas or regions in Victoria at the moment. The next one I want to talk about is different again. This is local government led, and this is Gold Coast Council. And Gold Coast Council is really fascinating because unemployment in Gold Coast is 1% higher than the rest of Australia, or it was in 2012 when this project was undertaken. And the biggest business in the Gold Coast region is the council. The council's about $1.5 billion. It's a mega council. It's got 1 million people who live inside its boundaries. And it spends $800 million a year on procurement. And they made a decision that as the biggest business, they had a responsibility and more to the point, an ability to change the economic destiny of that local area. So they made a decision to do local and social procurement and that was their key lever for addressing disadvantage. It wasn't their only lever, but it's one of their key levers. And this is what they did. So for contracts, this is the local, for contracts under 250,000, City of Gold Coast will only seek quotes from local businesses in the first instance. So if they can't find a local business who can do it, they will go outside of the Gold Coast region. It's quite staggering. And what I've got there are, when you go over 250,000, there's potentially a 30% weight attached to being local. So they open it up for over $1 million. If you are multinational that employs no one locally and your profits leave straight away, you get 0. If you're a local business that employs local people and retain your profits in the local community, you get 30, okay? And putting a 30% loading sure changes people's behaviour. It encourages businesses to establish in the Gold Coast region who want to win contracts in that area, and it incentivises and rewards those organisations who are in that community. They also did social procurement, which was really interesting. So they said local procurement will create jobs for people who are quite skilled. Social procurement will create jobs for people who are disadvantaged. And we want to bring disadvantaged people back into the labour market as well. And they did this in 2 ways. So they actually embargo some of their spend and tender opt, so they don't even go out to market. They directly source from social enterprises that can demonstrate they've got the capability to deliver on this. And what they're also doing is building capability in the Gold Coast region. And another point not here is they're doing social procurement with non-social enterprises as well. So they're doing mainstream businesses, and they're actually awarding contracts based on the number of jobs they can create for Gold Coast residents. That's the key criteria in their decision-making process. Capability and financial stability are just mandatory requirements. They're not weighted requirements. What's been really staggering is the Gold Coast spend has moved hundreds of millions to local business, okay? And the only data I had was from 2014, and it had moved over $150 million locally in 2014, between 2012 and 2014, which is quite staggering. The spend with social enterprises is now approaching 10 million per annum, which means it's creating hundreds of jobs for people who are highly disadvantaged in that Gold Coast region. Some of them are pathways jobs, some of them are destinations, and those people stay in those jobs indefinitely. And the last one I want to touch on is my organisation, which I'm very familiar with. So I'm quite comfortable talking about this until I turn blue in the face. And it's kind of nice that I'm getting to it last and I've still got time. So this is really good.
Jealous.
Yeah. So Social Trade is the organisation I work for. This is what we do. We have had various guises over the years, but about 3 years ago, we made a really strong decision. We could see that procurement was we believe it is the greatest opportunity, untapped opportunity to address disadvantage in Australia. There is over $600 billion of procurement every year in Australia, and most of it delivers little or no social benefit above and beyond the goods and services it's buying. So this is a huge opportunity in our minds. What we've done is create a marketplace. So we work with buyers on the left-hand side, and we work with them to build social enterprises into their supply chain. We work exclusively with social enterprises as suppliers, and our buyers are, let me see if I've got them here, these sorts of companies. So these are the companies we work with. Yeah, great. Let's give them a click. They are huge. None of them turn over under $50 million. Most of them are buying over $1 billion a year in stuff. None of them are buying more than 10 million a year from social enterprises, but they weren't buying anything from social enterprises in the past. 10 million makes a huge difference. Okay, it's quite staggering. So, and we're really only 3 years into this. So the upside in this marketplace is quite significant. And we're seeing a real shift in the world. I just finished what we do. So we work with them, and it's almost a subscription model. So they get access to our social enterprises and rich data on those organisations. They come to our meetups, and we do networking between buyers and suppliers. That's time, is it? 5. Oh, that's even better. Thanks. I didn't think I had 5, so that's really good. We do strategy development with them. So we would do an opportunity analysis, and this is the guts of the relationship. Where are the opportunities in your supply chain for social enterprises? Great. There's plenty of them. I was working with someone the other day. They said, oh, we've got a 270 million spend. Your opportunity and analysis has identified that social enterprises could supply us in up to $90 million of that spend. Now, that won't happen, I know, but that's the sort of access that they could potentially have to spend opportunities. We do a lot of staff engagement work. This is cultural change work. People will buy the way they've always bought, and unless you actually make a whole lot of effort to bring them on a journey, and this is an emotional journey quite often, because procurement people are, they're tickers and flickers, and they are quite often live in the world of black and white, and we're asking them to move into the world of grey a little bit. And the best way to do that is to get their hearts and minds engaged, because everyone knows someone who's disadvantaged somehow in their lives. And when you sort of say, if you bought differently, you could help that person, they start to realise that this is something they should be doing. On the other side, we work with social enterprises, and so we certify social enterprises. So we give our buyers a guarantee that they're buying from a social enterprise, and it's a really rigorous process. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it's quite rigorous in the sense that it's quite, it considers, we need legal documentation to support it. And we also do some skills development, and obviously they get access to the marketplace, which is the real opportunity, and it's where the rubber hits the road. And over the last 2 years, in FY18 and FY19, our buyers spent $105 million with our social enterprises, and it's on a really good trajectory. I mean, it was 30 million and then 75 million. We think it's going to be over 125 million this year. So it's sort of moving in the right direction. We also think it's going to be a $400 million market by 2025. Just our marketplace, not acknowledging the sort of other stuff that's happening around it. And that was generated by 53 buyers buying from 290 social enterprises. But the impact is probably the really exciting thing for me. 105 million created 700 jobs for disadvantaged Australians, created 220,000 hours of training. Some of these people weren't job ready at that point, and the training has now enabled them to get jobs. So they're probably further from the market than the 700 who got the jobs. 8 million in free or low cost goods or services that were provided by the social enterprises, and $2 million of funds just totally redistributed back into community services. So it's highly impactful in terms of, if 105 million can do that, imagine what $1 billion could do. Last slide. So procurement is over a $600 billion industry in Australia. We're really just beginning to scratch the surface of the community impact that can be generated. And we just think this is the greatest untapped lever for social impact. So it's really exciting to be in this space. I mean, back to anchors, which Wardy was really keen for me to talk about initially. I mean, all of these organisations have an anchor point somewhere. Sometimes it's the intermediary, like social traders, because there's no natural anchor when you've got a national marketplace. So the intermediary plays that role, just as they did in Geelong. They were a local intermediary who played the role of leveraging those local organisations and leveraging their wealth. And in Gold Coast, you've got a really strong anchor, just as you have with the Office of Housing in Fitzroy, who were the organisation who could actually lead and see all of the change that they were able to generate through that process. So sometimes we're seeing the leader, and sometimes we're seeing the organisation whose role is to leverage. And that was a really critical role that we play, I guess, helping to leverage a spend that's over $100 billion a year for social impact fundamentally.